This is my barn. It's an old milk barn. This side was where you milked cows. There was hay mounds on both sides. That's where you put the equipment. This was the barn door. It's way over here. This is the that's what connected the barn door to the barn. A tornado hit, and we lost our barn door. I know. While I was in class yesterday, so my wife emailed me this picture. And when I saw it, I was brokenhearted because it's a wonderful barn. It's just a perfect barn. Anyway, so I lost my barn door. The thing weighs about 500 pounds. I know. That's how green it is in Iowa. You can see that's our grass. This is a cornfield back here. This is a cornfield. Anyway, we live.
Are you a farmer?
No, we just live on an old farm property. We have about 5 acres. It's mostly orchard and lawn. So, yeah.
Nice.
I know, it's fun. I'm going home in October to help harvest the apples. So we'll see what happens. Not to eat, you don't eat the apples. We're going to take them and press them into cider.
So you're gonna bring back apple pies for everybody?
I cannot. You can't fly with that stuff in your luggage. I can't even fly with liquid.
Shipping?
So I can't even bring back apple cider. That's the way it works. Anyway, okay, so this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the legal system. We're going to talk about lawyers. I'm not lawyers. We're going to talk about lawyers. Yeah, at the end of the chapter we talk about lawyers. Right now we're talking about judges. Yesterday, Neil Gorsuch, one of the individuals that Donald Trump appointed to the Supreme Court, had an interview. This is Neil Gorsuch right here. That's Neil. He had an interview with NBC News, and he said he kind of exonerated himself. It's really kind of interesting. He said that we have a dynamic republic, and that if people want to change the Constitution, then they have to amend the Constitution. And of course the person said, well, isn't it difficult to amend the Constitution? And he got angry and said, this is a dynamic republic, and if people need to get involved in what's going on. So he's kind of exonerated himself for any decisions that he makes. So far he hasn't really made any controversial decisions, but it was kind of an interesting thing to say, acting like it was everybody else's fault but his, some of the decisions that he's made. Justices of the Supreme Court, like other federal judges, are appointed by the President, and they are confirmed by the Senate. And of course, this was a process that took place when Neil Gorsuch was appointed to the court, and then Brett Kavanaugh. Of course, Brett Kavanaugh was accused of sexually assaulting someone when he was in high school, and for that reason, it looked like he might not get appointed to the Supreme Court, but he was anyway. Most state court judges face elections. Supreme Court justices, of course, are appointed for life. So Neil Gorsuch is on the court forever. Where is the court? I just had it here, didn't I? No, I didn't. It was somewhere. There's the Supreme Court. There you go. Yeah, all these people are well, there's Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We have 3 females on the Supreme Court. Kagan, Sotomayor, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. 2 of these individuals have retired. This guy and this guy have retired. And they were replaced by Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. And the rest of those guys. Oh, there's Gorsuch is right there. That's Gorsuch right there. Anyway, one of those guys is retired. This guy is retired, I guess. And it looks like she's not in very good shape. She's fought off prostate cancer twice. Not prostate cancer. Pancreatic cancer. My goodness, she's a woman. How could she have a prostate? Okay. My goodness, what a day. So that's federal courts. So all the judges in federal court are appointed by the President of the United States. They are confirmed by the Senate. Trump was bragging the other day that he has appointed 188 federal judges. So what does that mean? Well, if he appointed federal judges that were conservative, that means the federal courts will be relatively conservative in the future, or they will maintain their conservative bent. However, if we're talking about Arizona, we're talking about New Mexico, these judges have to face election. All the judges of the state have to face election. Typically, the governor makes an initial appointment and the judge is then retained or not in popular elections. If retained, the judge serves a number of years, after which he or she again runs for retention. Supporters say that this makes judges accountable to the public. A judge who makes unpopular decisions can be removed. This is one of the problems. The other problem is close to elections, they get kind of mean to show that they are law and order. Since the 1990s, of course, we've had this movement in the United States to control people, and that control had to do with putting criminals in jail and keeping them there for an extended length of time. It was in the 1990s that the three-strike rule came about. So this is one of the things that we see around election time, and we're getting close to election time. We have an election in 2020. So we'll see what happens as far as your judges are concerned. This is not the time to commit a crime and to have to go to court because they may throw the book at you. Mainly because they're trying to show that they're law and order people. Judicial retention elections may invite pressure from special interest groups, and of course that's one of the problems that we have. A lot of times in the United States, it has to do with money more than anything else. There's also concern that judicial elections pose a threat to the fairness and the impartiality of the courts. Judges have been found to become more punitive as elections near, and of course that is to show that they are law and order individuals. There are at least two schools of thought about whether judges' rulings are influenced solely by the facts of the case and the applicable laws, or whether extra legal factors play a role. Does money have anything to do with anything? And the answer is, gollies, from time to time it sure seems to raise its ugly head. The whole Jeffrey Epstein case down in Florida, where he was convicted of trafficking, and then he plea bargained it down to almost nothing. So why in the world would they do that? They had all these individuals, and that's one of the reasons why Epstein was caught the second time. But they had to wait until he went to another jurisdiction. Down in Florida, he plea bargained, and he got a sweetheart deal, what they referred to as a sweetheart deal. So they had to wait until he went to another jurisdiction in order to arrest him for human trafficking. When he wandered off to, of course he had his own jets. He had 3 jet airplanes, and he had his own island in the Bahamas. Oh my goodness gracious. Anyway, so they had to wait until he went to another jurisdiction, and that jurisdiction was New York. And of course, New York wanted to throw the book at him. They had all of this evidence against him. A lot of it had been accumulated during his trial down in Florida, and it was just never used. So it looked like he was in pretty bad shape. Or he would have been in bad shape if he hadn't committed suicide. So that's one of the reasons why Jeffrey Epstein was able to be free, be relatively free, to the extent that he left the country. Normally, if you're a felon, other countries don't want you, but he had his own island, so he didn't have to worry about anybody rejecting him, as stupid as that sounds. Anyway, so his plea bargain, usually in a case like that, they ask the victims what they think should happen. And in this case, they didn't do that in the plea bargain down in Florida with the human trafficking. They didn't ask the victims how they felt about the deal that they were making. Normally they do, and this time they didn't. And for that reason, of course, they probably would have been pretty upset about it. They were very upset about it when they found out about it. So the question is, did it have to do with money? The fact that this man is a multimillionaire, he may have been a billionaire, he owned an island, he owned 3 jet airplanes. Did that have something to do with it? Are judges influenced by, are they influenced by money or lack thereof? I was reading an article last night that said marriage in the United States is declining, and the reason it's declining is because there are too many men in the United States who are economically disadvantaged, is how they talked about it. In other words, men are poor, so women don't want to marry them. Which doesn't seem fair to me. It's happened to me over and over again, but and I cried every damn time. Okay. There was a case in New Jersey. A young man, 16 years old, he was at a party. This young lady drank to the point that she passed out. So he stripped her naked and he had intercourse with her and filmed the whole thing. And then he sent the film, of course, put it on the internet of him having sex with this inebriated young lady. But he was an individual from a good family. He went to an expensive school, and when the judge heard the case, the judge decided that the question was, the prosecutor wanted to try him as an adult, and the judge decided against it. He said that no, this is a good young man. He has good SAT scores. He goes to a good school. He comes from a good family. That will ruin his life. I don't think that should happen. I know. So he was exonerated, or at least he was tried as a juvenile. As a juvenile, of course, when he turns 20, he only has to serve until he reaches the age of 21. After that, he's an adult. This is in New Jersey. He's an adult. And all of his juvenile records will be expunged because he did it as a child. Okay, so the judge decided because he comes from a good family and he goes to a good school and he has high SAT scores that this individual shouldn't be tried as an adult. The New Jersey Supreme Court heard the case. This is in July. This just happened last summer. A couple months ago, actually, the Supreme Court heard the case of the Supreme Court of New Jersey, and the Supreme Court of New Jersey decided that they overthrew that, and they are trying the young man as an adult. As interesting as all that is, you may not find that interesting at all, but it kind of pisses me off that this kid, just because he had a name, that he was able to not be prosecuted as an adult. But he is being prosecuted as an adult. Legal formalism, judges apply legal rulings in a careful, rational, mechanical way with little influence from political, social influences. That's known as legal formalism. So no matter how you feel, it doesn't really make any difference how society is trending at that moment. It doesn't really make a difference. With legal formalism, of course, the judge makes a decision based on facts of the case. Legal realism, judges' decisions are influenced by psychological, social, and political factors. If this kid hadn't been, if he was a 16-year-old and had raped an underage individual and filmed it and then put it on the internet, and of course, if he hadn't come from a wealthy family, if he was getting D's instead of A's in school, what would the judge have said? And of course, in this case, it's fairly obvious that the judge was influenced by the family name. Evidence suggests that trial judges do reflect on their own experiences, assumptions, and biases when reaching decisions from the bench, especially when the decisions involve some leeway. For example, if they allow a sentencing range, if it's first offense, they will give a minimum time in prison. If it's the third offense, they'll give the maximum amount of time in prison. Until recently, federal judges were almost exclusively male. Racial minorities and avowed homosexuals were also underrepresented on the bench. Once upon a time, it wasn't until the 1950s that we had our first Jewish Supreme Court justice. It was very rare for any individual that wasn't a Protestant to be elected to the court. But right now, all of the members of the Supreme Court are either Catholic or Jewish, which is kind of interesting because at the turn of the 20th century, both Catholics and Jews were denigrated. They were thought of as second-class religious citizens. So if you wanted to get ahead in the United States, you claimed to be Protestant. This is up until the 1950s. After the 1950s, well, actually World War II changed a lot of things. A lot of people went to war. We had to pull everybody together. So we pretended that everybody was equal. But there are still places in the United States where if you are Jewish, you can't join the club. You can't join the country club. You can't be a member of the club. This was very common in the early part of the 20th century. Groucho Marx, who was Jewish, was once told that they would waive the fact that he was Jewish to join the club, and he said, of course, he made a joke. He also made an obscene joke, but that's neither here nor there. He said that he wouldn't do it. He would rather not be a member of a club that would exclude other members of his family. Although there is a small bit of evidence that judges show in-group bias, the tendency to favor one's own group, their decisions generally cannot be predicted from their gender or race alone. So most judges, once they get on the bench, of course their decisions are more well-rounded. They are less biased than they potentially would have been if they were lawyers. Decisions by federal judges appointed by Democratic presidents differ from those of the judges appointed by Republican presidents. And of course, Neil Gorsuch gave that interview yesterday. Normally, Supreme Court justices don't interview very often. One individual that used to interview all the time was Antonin Scalia. Scalia was a very conservative judge, and he was potentially he was controlling things with his interviewing, with the fact that he interacted with the press a lot. So he changed a lot of people's minds. There is a difference between Democratic and Republican justices. They are different. One side is conservative, one side is more liberal, one side is progressive, the other side is conservative. One side claims that all they want to do is do whatever the Constitution says. And the other side says, well, sometimes we need to be more progressive than that. The Constitution was written over 200 years ago, about 250 years ago. So how can it possibly be something that we have to follow to the letter of the law? And that's the question. When the Second Amendment is a good example. The Second Amendment was written at a time when there was hostility all around the United States. And the hostility had to do with you guys. As I was teasing you last time that you guys are the problem. You guys have been the problem all along. What the reality is, of course, there were hostile tribes all along the frontier, and everyone needed to be armed in order to protect themselves. That's where the Second Amendment comes from. So what does that have to do with today? Or does it have anything to do with today? It's a law of the land. I mean, it says right there that you can be armed and no one can impinge that right. Of course, it also says that you have to be a member of a militia, which we don't have in the United States anymore. That's the second part of the Second Amendment, if you read it. The first part talks about them not being able to take your gun away from you, and the second one has to do with you being a member of a militia, or that the militia is the reason that you have your weapon. It's kind of like Switzerland. Switzerland has a military. You're in the military until you're 50 years old. All male members of the population are members of their national guard, in essence. They don't have a standing army. What am I talking about? Okay, so there is a difference between Republicans and Democrats. So if we look at the justices of the Supreme Court, of course, this is before Kavanaugh, this was before Trump was elected president. As you can see, more Republican presidents have appointed Supreme Court justices. Even before Trump, Obama was able to appoint 2 Supreme Court justices, as was Bill Clinton. But we have people that have been there for a while. Antonin Scalia, of course, is now dead. He died while he was still in office. They were going to replace him. Obama was the president. They tried to replace him. But the Senate wouldn't even hear they wouldn't even consider the appointment of Harlan Garrick. Is that his name? It wasn't Harlan, it was something else. Gary Carlin. I don't remember what his name was. Anyway. Cognitive psychologists have proposed 2 process models of human judgment, which are useful for understanding how judges make decisions. Models of human judgment distinguish between intuitive processes and deliberative processes. Intuitive processes are gut feelings, they're spontaneous. Deliberative processes involve thinking and concentrating about a select subject. So you have an intuition, your intuitive processes, and you have your deliberative processes. Now this gets really important because sometimes we are functioning by an intuition and sometimes we are thinking about things. Trump is a really fascinating person because he claims that all of his decisions come from his intuitive processes. He has gut feelings about things. And according to him, his gut is smarter than anybody else's brain. He said that several times. I'm not making this up. He thinks that his gut is more smarter than anybody else's deliberative processes. That curious as that is. He said some really strange things. Once upon a time, he said that he knew more about ISIS than the generals did, which was kind of interesting since he wasn't even president yet. He said he knew more about ISIS. And of course, he's just talking, and if people believe what he says, then they elect him president of the United States, and then they expect him to do what he said he would do, defeat ISIS and get us out of Afghanistan and whatnot. Hasn't happened yet. Although judges try to make decisions by relying on facts, evidence, and legal rules rather than on personal biases or emotions, because they are ordinary people, judges tend to have intuitive reactions. And of course, everybody does. Everybody has gut feelings. People get angry. Usually it's a spontaneous thing when you get angry. Judges have these kinds of reactions as well. Quick judgments can be overridden by complex deliberative thoughts, but judges must expend the effort to do so. They should never lose their temper in court. If they do lose their temper, it's showing that somebody is getting to them, that they're using intuitive thought rather than deliberative thought, and of course that's not the way the law is supposed to work. Judges have been shown to use intuitive decision processes to respond to suggested damage awards, descriptions of litigants' conduct, and inadmissible evidence. There was a case, the Chicago 7, You guys don't remember it because you were not born yet, but the Chicago Seven were protesters in Chicago in the 1960s, in 1968 specifically during the Democratic Convention. And they were creating chaos all over Chicago. It was quite a mess. I was there. I know. I hate Chicago. But I went there anyway. And it was quite a mess. And they arrested a bunch of people. And then they put the Chicago Seven. These were the seven leaders. And of course, throughout the proceedings, they were being disruptive. They couldn't shut them up. They had a gag order where there was one individual, Abby Hoffman, who came to court with a gag in his mouth, literally with a gag in his mouth every day. And the judge kept getting angrier and angrier, and he kept reacting to the infamous Chicago Seven, who are all dead now, by the way. But they've died of really strange things. Abby Hoffman committed suicide. Took a bunch of pills. But before he committed suicide, he did a switch where he did a 180-degree switch where he was very, very liberal before. He believed in anarchy. All of a sudden, he became extremely conservative. And it was actually after he became conservative that he committed suicide. As weird as that is. Lawyers who work in law firms attend to the needs of their firm's clients. Some of them specialize on labor law, and others are generalists so that they can do whatever needs to be done for the firm. Some lawyers work for corporations and have only one client. Of course, that is whatever their client is, Bell Telephone, Apple, whatever. And they are corporate employers. Their corporate employers are their company. I had a friend in Muncie. Muncie is a manufacturing town in east central Indiana. But there was Chevrolet was there, and General Motors was there. Delco Battery was there. Yes, ma'am.
So I just have a question about like lawyers and stuff. So if somebody is like can't afford a lawyer, like they're considered indigent, and they're appointed an attorney, who do they work for? Do they work for the state?
Excellent question. Yes, they work for the state, but they work for the state.
Because isn't
They get paid by the state. So yes, they do work for the state, but they're appointed in order to support you. So who do they work for? Well, they're being paid by the state, but theoretically they work for you.
But they probably won't work as hard to free you or all
If
that.
you hire a lawyer, then that lawyer will do his best to get you off. Okay. If the court appoints a lawyer, he will work as hard as he can to get you off. Because the more cases he wins, the more likely he's going to get more cases.
Oh, okay.
And more likely he's going to get private cases. My sister was a lawyer. She started out as a court-appointed lawyer. And she worked for Legal Services, which was it was a group of lawyers that were hired by the federal government to work in local cases. As interesting as that is.
I watched Law and Order one time, and the guy, who was it? I forgot his name. But he didn't want a lawyer because he said that, why would I want a lawyer who's really not going to help me anyway?
Sure. So he defended himself.
Yeah. Did he do that? Yeah, he won. I think he won. Like, barely.
Can you win? Sure you can win. But you have to understand the law.
Mm.
See, that's the trick. The law is kind of complex. It's very complex. So when something happens in court and you're defending yourself, if you're not a lawyer, you don't understand what's happening. Or they can maneuver around you, which is one of the other problems with the court. So the answer is that he works for the state, but he's been appointed by the court to support you. So does he really support you, or is he just tanking in order to get you convicted? And the answer is no, he can't do that. That's,
So basically, they all work for the state, the judge, the prosecuting attorney, and the lawyer?
and the lawyer that is working, is defending you. They all work for the state. They are all working for the state unless you hire your own lawyer. And then he's working for you. But this guy is supposed to work for you. Now, what happens in the case if he tanks? In other words, if he doesn't provide a very good defense, it can be overturned by the appeals court. Of course, it takes a lawyer to appeal the case.
Mhm.
So theoretically, he should appeal the case, but he's not going to appeal the case if he thinks that he's going to be sanctioned, because he can lose his license if he doesn't try to get you off.
Mhm.
So you see how this works, or how it's not working, or how it doesn't work. You understand?
I understand. A lot of my 20s was spent in the legal system.
Okay, well, sorry to hear
That's
that.
a story.
But
for
you're here
another day.
now, and-
Yeah,
okay.
I changed my ways.
You're out of jail, and you're with us today.
Does this also include the magistrate courts, like as in, like Gallatin's magistrate and district, and I don't know if any other courts are, even if they have a traffic court, but does that also include magistrate? Where, do they work for the state or do they work for the county?
They work, well, it all depends. Magistrate court works for the county,
But the district works for the state?
works for the state.
Okay.
And like New Mexico is different from Arizona, like night and day. So
So what does Arizona have?
Arizona has whatever Arizona has. I'm not exactly sure. I haven't, I know, well, no, I'm sure it has
I know we have power
correct legal system, but I just don't understand what it is. I've only been here for 4 years, and nobody's ever tried to arrest me yet, so. I'm doing really well. Many lawyers work for the government on the federal, state, or local level and have only one client, the governmental unit for which they work. I was telling you the story of my hometown. I had a friend whose wife was the daughter of the Chevrolet lawyer, and that's all he did. He defended Chevrolet. This time, this is back in the late 60s, early 70s. Chevrolet had a really bad car that they were being sued over. They also had a transmission that you could shift. If you pushed a button, you could change it into manual, but sometimes it would flop into manual all by itself. Whoops. It was also kind of a stiff gear shift system. They kept getting sued over that because it kept flipping in from automatic to manual, and people would be driving down the road, in first gear, and their engine's screaming, and then they burn up their engine. Anyway, so he was a multimillionaire, and his daughter is a multimillionaire today. And my friend, his father made transmissions, and he has like 37 different types of transmissions, and of course he's still being paid for them today. So both of them are millionaires. Prosecutors are government lawyers responsible for prosecuting individuals charged with crime. Federal prosecutors, called U.S. attorneys, are appointed by the president and prosecute people for violating federal laws. When Trump talks about the deep state, what he's talking about are these prosecuting attorneys. Most of these prosecuting attorneys, especially in the first year or 18 months of his administration, had all been appointed by by Barack Obama, by Obama, and he was very upset with them. He wanted to get rid of them, but he didn't know who to put in their places. Most of the people that he knew, were individuals who were making a lot of money, and they certainly didn't want to work for the federal government for peanuts. So he was having problems finding people to replace these individuals. Well, these individuals, of course, they work for the Department of Justice, Department of Justice, of course, at this time was under Jeff Sessions. They were having problems finding people to replace Barack Obama's people. And for that reason, of course, there was a lot of things coming out of the Department of Justice that they didn't like. There were cases being tried that they didn't want tried because, well, it was their friends that were being prosecuted. And for that reason, of course, they kept claiming that there was this whole deep state thing going on. And of course, that has a lot to do with the Russian probe, or the probe into whether how extensively the Russians interfered with our election and whatnot. And this is where the deep state comes from. This is where his concept of deep state comes from. Barack Obama's U.S. attorneys were still in place. And they're still having problems replacing these guys because most of the lawyers they know are making tons and tons of money. Okay, so that's the head prosecutors for cities and counties, called state's attorneys, are elected often in partisan elections. State's attorneys have, they're doing away with a lot of EPA laws, they're doing away with a lot of clean water laws because they say it's going to increase manufacturing in the United States. But state's attorneys are suing them because the states, of course, have some degree of autonomy. If you contaminate, well, a good example is what happened in Flint, Michigan. There's another city in Michigan with lead in their water. I'm trying to think what it's not Ypsilanti, it's Lansing, I think. Anyway, there's two cities in Michigan where you can't drink the water out of the tap. It's contaminated. And of course, they're suing the federal government. Yes, ma'am?
With them abolishing things like the EPA laws, will our country not become very similar to China, where it's, in the larger cities, almost a constant cloud of pollution, where people are wearing masks?
Well, there's a lot more manufacturing in China than there is in the United States.
Yeah, but if we increase our production of industry,
But are we actually doing that?
I hope they're not.
One of the things that happened in the 1960s and 1970s, well, let's see, wait a minute, when was Reagan elected president? 1980. The 1980s, he was giving a tax break. All these factories were claiming, all these individuals that owned the factories were claiming that they couldn't retool. They couldn't change their factories because they didn't have the money. The taxes were too high. So Reagan did away with all those taxes. He actually gave manufacturing a tax break. But what they did, instead of retooling their machinery, they moved their factories overseas because it's cheaper. The labor was a lot cheaper, and that's what was going on. That's been going on in the United States since the 70s. These people are moving overseas. So if you look at your shoes, especially if you have running shoes on, I'm the only, oh, there's some pair of running shoes. If you look at your running shoes, they're not made in the United States. Mine are made in Indonesia. Some of my running shoes are made in Vietnam, they're made in China. It's because we don't manufacture this kind of stuff in the United States anymore. Once upon a time, typewriters and computers were all made in the United States. Dell, we had that strange computer with that looked like a Holstein cow. I can't even remember who they were. Well, Gateway, yeah, Gateway, thank you. They're not made in the United States anymore. Even Apple's made over in China. So we don't manufacture in the United States like we used to. And the reason is because in the 1980s, he gave a tax break to the CEOs of these companies, and they took all their manufacturing overseas. Now that's one of the things that nobody wants to talk about, the fact that we kind of shot ourselves in the foot by giving them a tax break to move overseas. But it makes a lot of sense that they would do that. But since we have done that, the manufacturing in the United States has gone down, and because it has gone down, our water's cleaner and our air is cleaner because we don't have all this smoke and smog splashing into the air and into our
But we also-
streams.
We also have fewer jobs available too.
That's true.
So
That's-
where's the balance between the two?
Well, that's what Trump is talking about. See, that's one of the reasons why Trump was elected president. He claimed that he was going to bring all the manufacturing jobs back. Well, how in the world do you bring factories back into the United States? What are you going to do? And what kind of jobs are you creating anyway? One of the things that had happened in the 1950s and 1960s, one of the reasons that Reagan was elected president was because he was anti-union. So the manufacturing jobs in the United States were very expensive jobs. You could make a lot of money working at a manufacturing plant where they made parts for cars. I worked in 2 factories where we made parts for cars. And I made pretty good money. But the union people were making even more money. So he said that that's how we're destroying the United States. We're destroying the United States by, the unions are destroying the United States because they want too much money. They want too much. They not only wanted money, but they also wanted medical care. They also wanted dental care. They wanted, they wanted all this stuff. So he was the individual that was against the unions, and now, so most of the manufacturing was up in the Rust Belt. It was in Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin. It was up in that area, Buffalo, New York, northern Pennsylvania. That whole area was manufacturing, and those guys were making pretty good money. Well, none of that exists anymore. The reason we call it the Rust Belt is because all those factories have closed. What factories have stayed in the United States have moved down south, where the labor is cheaper, and there were no unions. So they either rebuilt their factories overseas, or they rebuilt their factories someplace where they didn't have unions. So whereas ball jars, the ball jars, were made in Muncie, Indiana for like ever, from the turn of the 20th century until the end of until the 1980s, they were manufactured in Muncie, Indiana, where they had a great union. After that, they moved to Tennessee. Why did they move to Tennessee? Because it's cheaper to manufacture. They didn't have the unions, and it's cheaper to manufacture down there. Okay, but most of these manufacturing jobs have moved away. They moved out of the United States. Can they move back? Well, probably not, because transportation costs are one thing, but if you can, in the United States, if it costs you $20, if you have to pay somebody $20 an hour to manufacture something, and you can pay somebody in China $5 an hour to manufacture the same parts, you're going to go to China and manufacture that part for $5, and then you're going to transport it back to the States. And hopefully the transportation costs aren't so great. This is one of the reasons why we have these huge container ships. They're full of parts, they're full of stuff.
Which
So
are now being transformed into homes.
well, now of course, he's got all this tariff war going on with China. So this is too interesting. So the state's attorneys prosecute individuals who have allegedly broken city, county, or state laws because many people accused of crimes cannot afford to hire a lawyer. Most defendants are represented by public defenders who are also government employees. So yeah, everybody's a government employee. Everybody works for the state. So what happens next? Well, I remember when, if you got arrested, they didn't read you any rights at all. Back in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s. If you watched television and you were watching a crime show, they just pull the guy in, they wouldn't tell him anything. But then in 1963, in the case of Gideon versus Wainwright, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that Clarence Gideon had the right to be represented by an attorney, even if he could not afford one. If you cannot afford one, then one will be appointed by the court. The court will appoint a lawyer. And theoretically, this lawyer works for you, even though he's being paid by the court, or actually he's being paid by the state. Nearly 2 years after he was sentenced, Gideon was given a new trial. With the help of a free court-appointed attorney, he was acquitted. So there you go. See, justice prevails. Once upon a time, if you read the story of Abraham Lincoln read law with a partner. He didn't know anything about the law, and he started reading law books, and that's how you did it in the old days. Back in Lincoln's time, you apprenticed yourself to a lawyer, and you started reading law with that select individual. You had very simple cases. And then, of course, as time went on and you gained more and more experience, then you tried more and more complex cases. That's the way it was done in the United States until the 20th century. In the 20th century, select states decided that in order to get a law degree, or in order to be a lawyer, you needed to get a law degree. So you had to go to college for the law. I went to a very traditional school. This is back in the 60s. We didn't have a pre-law program. The individuals that wanted to be lawyers, and there were tons of them in my graduating class. If you wanted to be a lawyer, then you studied something else. You didn't study the law. You studied political science. You studied psychology. I have one friend that is a lawyer who studied Greek and Latin. And as you're going to see, a lot of the words that in the law are actually Latin words. And because of that, he actually can read Latin. He's a very interesting person. He's a lawyer who sues other lawyers for malpractice. I know, everybody hates him. I think it's cool. They were influenced by the American Bar Association. The states gradually increased the educational requirements for taking the bar exam. First requiring some college, then some law school, and finally graduation from an accredited law school. If you go to law school, you go to law school right out of your bachelor's degree. It's usually a 3 or 4 year program. It sounds like it should be a PhD, but it's not. Lawyers are not doctors. So if we had a lawyer teaching at this institution, I'm Dr. Bradway, Dr. Wolf, Dr. Lerma, we have all these doctors wandering around with PhDs or EDDs. Dr. Haskey's an EDD. But a lawyer's not a doctor unless he has a doctor of jurisprudence, which means he has 4 years of law school on top of his law degree. Okay, that makes him a doctor, but they still don't call him a doctor because of academia. Academia is kind of funny. We're kind of funny. We're kind of stuck in our ways. Some people get to be doctors and some people don't get to be doctors. Lawyers never do get to be doctors unless they have a degree in something else. College professors who teach law, like Elizabeth Warren or Barack Obama. Barack Obama was a law professor before he was the president of the United States. He was not referred to as doctor, he was referred to as professor, as is Elizabeth Warren is a professor as well. She's not a doctor either. Sheldon and Krieger in 2004-2007 have found that attending law school tends to undermine students' values, motivation, and mental health. This is a song. I was going to play the song, but it's not a song about lawyers at first. It's some lady from Canada. She wrote a song. They suggest that psychological dysfunction is related to changes in motivation that occur over the course of one's law career. Usually people go into law because they want to change the world. Okay. But that only lasts for a year. After that year, all bets are off.
Is that Carly Rae Jepsen?
Yes.
Yeah.
You want me to play the song? Okay, do you need the song?
No.
Sheldon and Krieger in 2004-2007 used DC and Ryan's 2000 self-determination theory of optimal motivation to explain the situational and personality factors that cause positive and negative motivation and eventually changes in the subjective well-being. This gets really weird. So if you go to law school, this is what happens to you. The first year you go in and you have all these wonderful ideas. Sheldon and Krieger in 2004 found that the increase in mental health symptoms in the first year of law school was correlated with a decrease in intrinsic motivation. So the motivation is coming from inside. And then you start reading the law and you realize it doesn't have anything to do with right and wrong. It has to do with how good you can talk. It has to do with how well you can argue. If you're good at arguing, then potentially you're going to win your case. So this intrinsic motivation that you have is lost after the first year, after you realize what's going on. In the first year, students move from pursuing their professional goals for reasons of interest and enjoyment, that's the intrinsic motivation, of course, to pursuing goals that would please and impress others, extrinsic motivation. As weird as that sounds, and you lose it in the first year of law school. A lot of people drop out of law school the first year. In order to be a lawyer, you have to be kind of arrogant. You have to think that you're smarter than the guy over sitting at the other table. And if you watch television shows, you see this. People who are lawyers will admit this. They think that they're smarter than everybody else. Because they know something that you don't know. And the one thing that they know that you don't know is that the truth doesn't have anything to do with justice. Justice doesn't have anything to do with truth. Justice has to do with who talks the best and whether I'm smarter than you are. Why in the world was it looked like a slam dunk that O.J. should have been convicted for murder? Not one person, but two people. But he was acquitted. Why? And there is a majority of the people in the United States that still to this day think that O.J. murdered his ex-wife. How in the world did he ever get off? He had a great law team, and that's what happened. Sometimes it has to do with what evidence can be presented. So the judge makes decisions as to what evidence can be presented. And sometimes the evidence that you need is not there. The evidence that would bring out the truth is not there. And that's the way the law works. It's an art form. It doesn't have anything to do with truth. It does have something to do with truth. This is what we are pursuing, but a lot of times we don't get there. Because it has to do with who can talk the best. Although 80% of lawyers said that they were proud to be lawyers, about 81% said their work is intellectually stimulating. Only about half the respondents voiced satisfaction with their careers. Only 40% would recommend that others pursue law as a career. There is a cognitive dissonance that has to take place in order to be a lawyer.
So don't be a lawyer.
Well, you're going to be a psychologist, so you're really looking for the truth. You are looking for the truth. Don't expect a lawyer to look for the truth. So if a lawyer has a mental illness, a lot of times it has to do with the fact that he is living a lie. He doesn't like himself. Most lawyers do not like themselves. As a matter of fact, they hate themselves because they've done things that they wish that they knew was wrong. They knew it was wrong. Okay. So they hate themselves. This is true. They still think they're smarter than everybody else.
So don't trust a lawyer?
Well, yeah, you can trust a lawyer, but if it comes to money, then they're going to go with the money every time. So they're kind of greedy, I guess. That's why
I know they are.
Yeah.
It has to do with money. And the more money you have, the more, they'll defend you whether you're right or wrong. Because that's what the law says. That makes it tough. So in half of all cases, half of all the lawyers that are trying cases that are that they know the individual is guilty. So if this is, especially if you're a defense attorney, if you're a defense attorney, you're defending people that you know are guilty. So what does that do to your ethics? What does that do to your mindset? How do you feel about yourself? I know, this is why my sister got out of, she was working as a defense attorney for legal services. And this is one of the reasons why she left. Because she wanted to do the right thing. This whole intrinsic motivation thing, she was able to carry that through her whole law school. She went to school with a guy that eventually became vice president of the United States. Dan Quayle was in her law school. And they went to school together at night, as weird as that sounds. And Dan Quayle sold his soul to the devil. But my sister didn't. And of course, Dan Quayle's still alive, and he was the vice president. Now he was already a multimillionaire. But that's not important. Really kind of interesting how lawyers think. So could you trust my sister as a lawyer? She started working for the state and writing laws. And the laws that she wrote were anti-stalking laws and spousal abuse laws and whatnot. Non-white lawyers tend to be less satisfied than white lawyers, although they still recommend a legal career to others, and they tend to regard law as a promising opportunity. Lawyers are generally less satisfied than judges or law professors. So a lot of people will go into the law so that they can help protect Indian lands, native lawyers. There are native lawyers all over the place. A lot of these individuals don't make it through law school. A lot of individuals that start with law school don't make it through because they realize that it has a lot to do with something other than the truth and what is right. So it's not as much right as it is how the law is written. And sometimes the law will change on one word in the law. Lawyers are generally less satisfied than judges or law professors. Once you become a law professor or you become a judge, then truth does suddenly become important. As a lawyer, of course, you have to argue both sides of the law. Lawyers without typical lawyer traits may be the most discontented by the practice of law. The therapeutic use of the law may promise a less adversarial future for laws. This individual was a lawyer, and then she decided that she's too pretty, so she should be a model. So she's a model who has a law degree. Now she's a model who has a law degree. Anyway, I don't know. It's not important. It was just one of the cases. People generally do tend to be more confident than correct. This is known as overconfidence bias. For lawyers, this means that they are overly confident of their abilities, including their ability to predict and produce successful case outcomes. Now remember, most of these lawyers are very outgoing individuals. You don't want to get stuck in a room with 5 or 6 lawyers, because their egos are so huge that the room will explode. Because all these guys, they're all extroverts, they're all talking, they're all right, everybody else is wrong. It makes for a very difficult conversation. They have what is known as overconfidence bias. They're going to win every case. Well, you can't win every case. There's a winner and loser in every case. So 50% of the time, they're probably going to be incorrect. Lawyers have to make predictions about case outcomes years in advance. These are probabilistic estimates. The correct answer is not yet known, of course. You don't know how the judge is going to decide. You don't know how a jury is going to decide. But you have to make predictions as to what's going to happen next. Lawyers, like all, make more optimistic predictions about events in the distant future than in the near future. Another reason for lawyers' overconfidence is their belief that the outcome of the case is largely under their control, the illusion of control. Who actually has control over a case? Well, it's the judge or the jury, of course, have control over the case. So there is this illusion of control. But of course, if they didn't have that huge ego, they wouldn't be able to be lawyers. Seeking feedback from other lawyers can help lawyers make more accurate predictions about future case outcomes. Researchers found that discussing the value of a case with just one other person led them to the most accurate assessments. And of course, this is one of the reasons why lawyers rarely practice alone. They usually are in a group. It's so that they can bounce ideas and bounce strategies off of each other. As weird as that may sound. All right, let's talk about bad guys. Yeah, let's talk about bad guys. All right, we're going to talk about the psychology of crime. Why do people commit crimes? Questions about the causes of crime or the concern of criminology, which is the study of crime and criminal behavior. Once upon a time, we thought we were going to get a criminology program here at Lene College. When I first got here, that's the reason why we're teaching this class. It's the only reason it is a required class, because we thought we were going to get the police academy on the other side of the campus. And so we'd have all these people trained to be policemen, and they would have to take this class. That's the reason this class is a required class. I know. What's going to happen in the future? What's going to happen in the future, this is a 300 level class. We will have a group of 300 level classes, and you can choose which 300 level class you want to fulfill the requirement to get your bachelor's degree. That is on the new checklist. This is a 300 level class, so that's what's going to happen in the future. Will this class still be taught? Well, if nobody takes the class, then you probably will drop it. It's kind of an interesting class, but it was initially put in the program because they thought that we were going to get the police academy. According to the National Crime Victimization Survey, the rate of violent crimes has been dropping since 1999. Well, what happened in 1999? Well, in the 1990s, of course, we had that movement in the United States, the law and order movement in the United States. So if you wanted to be elected president, you had to be a law and order president, a candidate anyway. And of course, the crimes tend to decrease during Democratic administrations. It declined markedly during the Obama administration. It declined markedly under Bill Clinton. But then it increases under Republicans. Does anybody have any idea why this occurs? Why are there more crimes under Republicans than there are under Democrats? Democrats tend to be more liberal. Republicans tend to be more conservative. They tend to be stronger as far as law and order is concerned. They're the ones that are overthrowing the gun laws. The gun laws in Texas, they had that mass shooting in El Paso, or then they had the mass shooting in Odessa, Texas. And it was that day that the law changed. Their gun laws in Texas changed to be more liberal and to allow you to carry guns in more places. Now, if you are going into Walmart and you've got a gun, they don't want you to go in, or they want you to put your gun in the car. If you go into Walgreens, they don't want you to come in the store with a gun. Walmart has decided that they're not going to sell ammunition anymore because of all the gun violence. They used to sell 40% of all the ammunition that was sold in the United States was sold at Walmart. Now they're not going to sell ammunition anymore, as curious as that is. So violent crime is actually going down. Does anybody have any idea why crime goes up during Republican administrations?
Laws change.
They become more conservative. It's a conundrum. It doesn't make any sense. Should be the other way around. if Democrats are more liberal, then people should feel freer to commit crimes during Democratic administrations, but that's not the way it works. Usually the economy improves during Democratic administrations, and economies suffer under Republicans. And the reason is because Republicans tend to favor corporations and wealthy people, and Democrats will give tax breaks to everybody. And of course, that doesn't always happen with Republicans. The rate of violent crimes is still relatively high despite recent decreases. 17 out of every 1,000 residents aged 12 or older living in urban areas were victimized by violent crime in 2009. Of course, that was 10 years ago. In 2002, I had just left, when these guys started blowing people away, I had just left Washington, D.C. I didn't have anything to do with it, didn't have anything to do with me. We had just left the state. We had just left the District of Columbia and moved to, as a matter of fact, the first shooting was the day after we left, the first person that was killed. In 2002, John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo terrorized Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. They shot 13 random people, killing 10 of them. And of course, the police had a really difficult time figuring out who was doing this because they were completely random. Normally, when somebody kills somebody, it's a relative. It's somebody that knows that person. They killed them for a reason. But these guys were just killing for no reason whatsoever. So it was almost impossible to tell who they were. The only reason that they were caught was because they had stopped at a rest stop, and somebody noticed a hole in the back of their vehicle. They saw the hole, and at that point, they recognized that possibly this was the hole that they were shooting out of, and that's exactly what was going on. So they arrested. I know it was so random that they actually caught these people. They shot 13 people and they killed 10 of them. They were active for 3 months. They were shooting people at gas stations in Washington, D.C. People were deathly afraid to stop and get gas, as weird as that sounds. In 2004, Charles Allen McCoy Jr. began sniping at cars passing by on the interstate. He was dubbed the Ohio Highway Sniper. McCoy killed one woman and terrorized many people driving on the Ohio interstates. This was right outside of Dayton. And of course, I was stationed in Dayton in 1972.
You like in the wrong places at the wrong time?
No, I'm there at the right time because I just leave. I left Oklahoma City just before he blew up the Murrah building.
You're barely missing all of
I
these.
know, I'm
What are
missing
you
all these
doing
things.
there?
Well, I don't have
He's
anything.
probably the one doing it.
Does this look like me? I mean, really. This is something that happened last week. On September 3rd, a 14-year-old shot and killed his 3 siblings, his father and his stepmother with a 9mm handgun. He was upset when he learned that his stepmom was not his biological mother. So he killed everybody in the family.
How did he get his hand on the gun?
The youngest sibling was 6 months old, and the oldest was 6 years old. There's the 6-year-old, and there's the baby, and there's Dad. He's a real looker, isn't he? Anyway, he shot them all, killed them all. Shot them all in the head. Then he claimed somebody else did it. He was a 14-year-old. But this is in Elkmont, Alabama. Shot his whole family. Shot and killed his whole family. Stepmom, dad, and all of his 2 brothers and his sister. Shot them all. And this just happened 7 days ago. Today's the 10th, right? Tomorrow's the 11th. Although the number of serious violent offenses committed by persons ages 12 to 17 declined by 61% from 1993 to 2005, juveniles continue to be responsible for committing about 24% of violent crimes. And because of that, and we can't prosecute them, it's very difficult to control these individuals' behavior. Youths under 18 years old commit approximately 12% of sexual assaults, 18% of robberies, 22% of aggravated assaults, and 8% of all the homicides. In 1999 to 2000, 71% of students in public schools reported experiencing one or more violent incidents. 71%, 3 out of every 4 people reported experiencing one or more violent incidents, and 20% reported serious violent incidents, which include rape, sexual battery other than rape, a physical fight with a weapon, and a robbery with or without a weapon. However, only about 36% of these schools reported one or more of these incidences to the police. So if there's a rape on this campus, then we have to tell the federal government. And that goes into a federal database. And when they start talking about how safe it is on campus, then these statistics will come out. My son works in a high school in Florida, in Fort Myers, Florida. There was a young lady that had been trafficked, and she left traffic. She left the business, and she started to go back to school. She started when she was 12 years old. She'd been trafficked when she was 12, and she started to go back to school when she was 14 years old. Somebody at the school found out, and a football player decided that he was going to, since she had already experienced this before, that he was going to sexually assault her. So he took her into the boys' bathroom, and he was joined by several other individuals, and it became a gang rape on this poor young 14-year-old girl that had been trafficked before. This is not a happy story. Of course, they discovered what was going on. It was being filmed. It was being live streamed onto the internet at the time. This is just before my son got to this school. And one of the reasons that he got the job at this school was because he was a bouncer at a bar. He's kind of a big kid. I call him a kid, he's 48 years old. He's kind of a big guy, and they thought that potentially he could control this kind of stuff. He had tangled with football players in Los Angeles before, professional football players before, and he'd been able to handle this kind of a situation. So that's one of the reasons why he was hired. The individuals that committed the gang rape, the only one that was prosecuted was the guy that was live streaming the video. The one that started the rape was back in school. And unfortunately, he was in my son's class. My son was told that no matter what he does, you're not supposed to react to it. You can't do anything. You certainly can't touch. You can't touch a student in Florida unless they touch you, unless they attack you, and then you can defend yourself. That's potentially what's supposed to happen. This kid is still in his class, and he sits in the back of the room and he does odd things in the back of the room. He was never kicked out of school. None of the kids, and they were all on film, of course, none of the kids, nothing happened to any of these kids. They weren't kicked out of the school. They changed the school of the 14-year-old. Of course, she had been trafficked before. This is all a really, really sad story. And he's dealing with this every day. And those kids, some of those kids are in his class, and they're sitting on the back row. No offense to those of you on the back row, but they sit in the back row and they make noise and they don't learn any math. And sometimes they do very odd things like masturbate at the back of the room.